Hi, and thanks for listening. Before we begin, we just wanted to reassure you that if you have worked with any of our hosts or guests, that we treat your privacy with the utmost of respect. Therefore, you won't hear us divulging any confidential or identifiable details about you or your loved one in any of our episodes. Unless, of course, you would like to be featured as a guest yourself and talk about your experiences. In which case, please do get in touch with us via the contact details at the end of the show. That said, let's get on with the next episode.
Welcome back to Over My Dead Poddy, the podcast that aims to bust the myths on funerals and answer all of those questions that you thought you could never really ask. And thank you so much for your feedback to our last episode. You have been blowing up our socials with your comments and your feedback. If we can't answer them all personally, we'll try and answer as many as we can in this episode and future episodes. But please do keep getting in touch with us. We love hearing from you. So on this episode, we really want to tackle some of those firsts, the first conversation with a funeral director or an officiant, the sort of things you're going to be asked when we first meet you, to try and help you prepare for those and just not feel as scared. The whole purpose of this podcast is about helping you feel more comfortable and more confident so that you have everything you need in place ready to have the conversations. Of course, I am ably supported by my brilliant co-host, Carl. So, Carl, how are you doing this week?
Yes. Hi, guys. Great to be back again.
So, Carl, you are probably one of the very first people that a family will think about speaking to, maybe even before they've lost their loved one, when they're preparing for a funeral. So what are some of the first questions that they ask and some of the information they'll need on that very, very first phone call to a funeral director?
So I think it's a great question, but I think before we start on that question and give the answer, I think it's always very important for families to understand that they really do have so much choice right from the get-go. So before we start the first call to a funeral director, it's important to understand that families have the choice to choose their own funeral director. So whether they know somebody within the industry or they've had experience with a particular director, it doesn't matter, even if that particular funeral director isn't within that town centre or the village or wherever you may live or the city. You've always got that choice to choose whoever you want. And then from there, once you've made that informed decision, you can then move forward and prepare yourself to call a funeral director. And I think a lot of families really do think that that's one of the first daunting steps that they have to make is literally to call a funeral director. Funeral directors now are literally on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's always a voice at the end of the phone. Me personally, working for the company that I do, it's a local team who look after families, so we'll always get somebody local with us. And initially, of course, you need the essentials. So, of course, full name, nice and easy. Then from there, we potentially would ask date of birth, but again, it's not the be all and end all. But whether we're looking at if the death has been verified, that's the first important point.
So, Carl, I'm just going to stop you there for a moment, as that reminds me of a scenario I had quite a while back where I was working with a family of a non-UK native, and their family thought that they were perhaps 100, 101 years old. But back in the country where they were born, it wasn't part of their culture to record the birth year for people, just the month and the date. So they couldn't be really sure about when their loved one was actually born. So we kind of made an estimate, but they were really worried that that might slow down the process or they wouldn't be allowed to proceed because that they didn't have that missing piece of information. But I guess that's not always the case, and we understand sometimes we're dealing with some of these cultural nuances and complexities that make things a little bit trickier.
Yeah, you're right. It does. I mean, in all cultures and ways of life, there are many different things that we need to be mindful of when as a funeral director asking these questions as well. We have to respect all the cultures and make sure that we're doing the right thing for that person who's sadly passed.
So you talked there about when families make their first call to you, and often we think that's going to be after a loved one's passed. But actually, sometimes it can happen before. If someone themselves wanted to get in touch with you and say, I want to take some of the stress away from my family, so can I put some plans in place? So you'll take calls from people who are still living but want to try and put some arrangements in place.
Of course we do, yes. I mean, we're here for any conversations. When you think about sort of the first call, potentially families could ring up just for that little bit of information. Now, there is obviously looking into other podcasts that we could do about pre-planning funerals and prepaying. That's a whole new episode. But, just for that purpose, there's so many different questions and answers that we can do. And just having that initial call when you're in that, it's a different mindset as well. So, if you're waiting, unfortunately, when someone's, you're expecting someone to pass, just making that phone call, you're in a different mindset and you have a different set of questions, and, potentially you do feel a lot better for doing it.
I think what you're saying there is, whatever your situation, don't be scared about picking up the phone to a funeral director just to start the conversation if that's what makes you feel more comfortable. But often we like to think that people pass away very neatly in a nursing home or at home or a hospital. Sometimes that happens more violently or unexpectedly. So if somebody's loved one's in a hospital, do they still ring you? How does that process work when they're not with their loved one when they've passed away?
So there are many different situations, of course, when people pass away and nobody knows when it's going to happen. So the different scenarios, you potentially, as you mentioned, Nicola, about passing away in a nursing home or even in a hospital, there are different telephone conversations that are going to happen compared to somebody who is, tragically passed away at a road traffic accident or something that's, completely out of the blue. And I think that's, again, something to be mindful of, is that the conversations to be had and the calls that are going to be coming in potentially maybe from a police officer who is unfortunately having to break the news, and then that's when we then come in and go from there.
So as well as you looking at who you might want to use as a funeral director, talking to family, finding recommendations, there are also the times where we have, I think my language is correct, a coroner's removal or a coroner's recovery, where the coroner would instruct a funeral director to go and collect the body from a sudden death. And you might be informed by that funeral director that they've taken your loved one into their care. But if you don't feel it's right to work with that funeral director going forward, am I right in saying that you don't have to stick with them? You have the choice to change that if you want to.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, as you quite rightly mentioned, the coroner's removal is a funeral director acting on behalf of the coroner. So there is a list which the coroner has, or the police control room have, and what they do is they literally call a funeral director on the list and they work through that list just to make sure that there is somebody able to attend and bring their loved one into care. Now, again, that might not be their chosen funeral director, so the list is endless. There are many, many funeral directors who are on that list, and some funeral directors aren't even on the list at all because they just, they can't do it, they can't cover that sort of thing 24 hours a day. So what a funeral director should do, or a good funeral director should do, is when they arrive at the home, they say, okay, they would obviously introduce themselves and they would mention their business, which is perfectly fine. But they should also mention that they are there acting solely on behalf of the coroner because they've been instructed by the coroner to bring that person into care or take them, to the hospital.
Well, you were just talking about a coroner's removal, and the likelihood of which is that the deceased will be taken into a hospital and a funeral director will take somebody into their care from there. But if somebody has passed away at home or at a nursing home, and perhaps the family have made that first phone call to a funeral director, who then turns up at their house? What happens? What are the next steps for somebody to look after their loved one and actually take them into your care?
Yeah, and I think what we've alluded to before is that there's a lot of daunting first steps. The whole start of this arrangement, or the whole part of the whole process of somebody passing away, is daunting from start to finish. And then these are just sort of the next steps, the next processes that happen. Speaking just from the company who I work for, is that myself as a funeral director and a member of our team will come to the house or the nursing home. we're typically dressed in our suits, which I think is a very respectful mark. It's something nice that happens. And then from there, as a funeral director, my role then starts, and I then start explaining things to families. But as we've always said, death waits for nobody, and this could happen at any time, day or night. And at 3 a.m, families and loved ones aren't thinking straight. So my role is to come in and explain things in a very simple way that you'll remember, but essentially, if you forget it all, it's not the end of the world. And, the conversations that we have, the first calls on the telephone, we then just reiterate them and make sure that we have got the correct, it's literally as simple as the spelling of a first name or a surname. We have to have that correct right from the get-go.
Carl, I know for you as funeral directors, when you go to somebody's home, you're really conscious of the fact that they're grieving, they're in shock. Sometimes there's a lack of dignity in death, and you've got to be really respectful of how you care for somebody's loved one. So what can they expect for you and your team to be doing to take their loved one into your care?
Okay, so when we turn up to, obviously, a family home, we have to be mindful that nobody chooses where they want to die, of course. But if you were to think that, as the listeners would think, if they were in the back bedroom of their own home, how is somebody going to get their loved one out of there respectfully and to keep everybody safe? So there is, as everybody says, there's not really much dignity. There's no dignity in death. And our role as funeral directors is to make sure that we bring their loved one out of their home in a respectful manner. It's as simple as that.
And Carl, the one thing we promised our listeners is that we'd be really honest and really human. And there are times, perhaps, when people pass away naked or in difficult positions, or they've maybe been drinking, or drugs might be involved. And all of those situations, as a funeral director, you and your team will have seen before, and are absolutely not there to judge. Every death deserves respect, and you will treat that accordingly.
Yeah, you're 100% correct. That person, is somebody's loved one. It's somebody's son. It's somebody's daughter. It could be anybody. And our role is to make sure that that person is looked after from the moment we step into that home to the moment of the end of the service. It's as simple as that.
But one of the things we would add to that is in that very first phone call you make to a funeral director, if you think there are any difficult circumstances, and I'm going to be really honest, those situations where perhaps somebody is a little heavier than normal, or there are drugs or kind of dangerous items around a room, just tell us in that first call so at least we can prepare and make sure that our team understand the situation and can make that as dignified and respectful as we can. So just kind of don't be afraid of sharing some of those details with us that you might find a little awkward.
I fully agree. And, sometimes the more information that families can give us, just these little heads up, really does make that difference for the team coming to that home or to the nursing home, of course. And the more information, the better, certainly.
And it is all about helping you to look after your loved one in the best way that we possibly can. So from that first call, somebody's loved one has been taken into your care. It might be 3 o'clock in the morning. You leave the family to try and, I wouldn't say get some sleep, but get some rest, maybe collect their thoughts, and probably get a phone call from you the next day. And what are the first questions? We've probably got name, we've got date of birth, we've got those basic details about their loved one. But what are the next lot of questions that you're going to be asking them in that first call?
Well, I think for us, we ask sort of all these different questions. Are we looking at a burial or a cremation? Will it be a religious service or a non-religious service? These are just some of the basic questions. But a lot of families then counteract it and ask us, say, well, how do we get a death certificate? Where's this coming from? How do we do this? How long have we got to register the death? And as of the 1st of September last year, 2024, the whole registration process changed. And previous to that, you would have 5 days to register a person's passing. That was the law. You had to do it within. So that was a death certificate being produced by a GP, collecting that, taking it to a registrar, and registering that person's death. Now, what I'd like to stress at this point is that this has now completely changed, and now there's not such an immediate rush because that doesn't happen. What happens now is that a death certificate is produced by a medical practitioner, whether it's in the local GP, like, such as if you pass in a nursing home. Excuse me. If you pass away in a hospital, the process is slightly different. That obviously a death certificate is produced, and then collectively it's then sent to a medical examiner's office. It's then checked by a medical examiner, sent back to the same GP, and then forwarded on to a registrar. Now that whole process now has gone from having to been done within 5 days, is now taking sometimes up to 2 weeks, and that unfortunately is for the worse, and it leaves family just in complete limbo. There's nothing we can do until that death's registered, which is, it's really heartbreaking for some families.
And oh my gosh, we feel your pain. And this isn't us having a go at the system. The system is right, and it's the system that needs to be in place, but it just takes a little bit of time. But Carl, I'm just trying to get this process really clear in my head for our listeners. So outside of the hospital, somebody passes away in a nursing home or at home. Certifying somebody's death is different to registering. So who can certify that that person has actually died?
So certifying somebody's death can't just be done by the mum, dad, brother or sister, or us. It has to be by a medical professional. So whether you've called the ambulance and the ambulance professionals are there, or whether it's an on-call doctor, or any of the medical teams that are available. So you've got obviously your Marie Curie teams and everybody alike. Yeah, palliative care teams, and so on.
So a medical professional certifies death. Then what's the next bit of paperwork that people need to be asking for?
Well, what they ask for is unfortunately they don't get is the death certificate, and that just takes forever to turn up. There is ultimately some paperwork that has to be done by that medical professional certifying the death, which is then passed over to the funeral director, which is nothing that anybody, nothing to be frightened of, just the basics of, all of the tests of death. So has the person, not been breathing for a certain amount of time, and all these different tests that go on, which is then passed to the funeral director.
So that process happens, and any funeral director will talk you through the stages that you need to go through, the people you need to speak to in order to get to the point where we can authorise for a funeral to go ahead. Now, I use the word funeral there, and I'm going to come to Carl in a second, just to explain the difference to us between the legal disposal of a body and a funeral, because I believe they're two different things.
They are indeed. So what we get typically in Yorkshire is, we don't need a funeral. My dad said just bury us in the garden, chuck us in the bin, which it all sounds fine, yes, I'm sure he did say that, but legally we can't do that. One of the biggest requests I get working within North Yorkshire and Richmond is, he just said chuck us in the swale and we'll just have done with it. I tell you, we can't do that. As much as it would look good, we'd have a Viking burial, fire arrows onto a craft and set it on fire. I'm sure it appeals to many, but that unfortunately doesn't happen. You don't necessarily have to have a funeral. That doesn't happen. You don't need to do it, as long as the person is either buried or cremated, and they're the options that you have. And then from there, you can then design your own farewell service, or as what a lot of people like to call it, is a farewell party. And that's when the difference is between having a church service and a service before, and then either a burial or a cremation, as opposed to having the burial or cremation first, and then having a celebration of life after, which is where you come in, Nicola, on your side of things, I'm sure.
Absolutely. So the legal disposal of somebody's remains could be a direct cremation, and that is a whole other episode and a can of worms that we will come to in due course. But just for now, we're going to stick with presuming that you're going to have a funeral service, which, as Carl said, could be in a crematorium, or it could be in a church, it could be a cremation, or it could be a burial. And what we start to do when we plan a funeral is actually put the ceremony together. And that's where hopefully I step in and I can help you. So some of the things that your funeral director might ask you about in that very first call, in terms of starting to put that ceremony together, are things like music, or if anybody would like to speak, if you'd like to show photographs. And Carl, there are so many options to make services really, really personal these days. So what are some of the things that families would need to think about in terms of those elements of the service?
Yeah, there's so many different elements to a funeral service. And I think what families need to understand and need to know is that funeral directors are there to guide families and suggest different options, but ultimately the service itself is put together by someone like yourself, Nicola, or any minister, whether it's Church of England or whoever. My role as I come in and start these initial conversations is we need to be, or have you had any discussions on potentially pieces of music? Or are we looking at sort of orders of service? Have we looked at photographs? And now as services sort of progress and evolve, services now, it's, in my view, is now a celebration of that person's passing. So certainly at the crematoriums, and churches are now evolving as well, but the service can be live streamed. We can have photos, we can have slideshows, and pretty much you name it, we can do it nowadays. My role is then to suggest these things, and then obviously you then follow it up with your knowledge and then put that whole service together to create the whole service.
So, Carl, it really feels like we're starting to get to that point where we're beginning to craft a ceremony. And that might be the difference you see between a funeral director and your officiant, whether that's a minister, a humanist, or an independent celebrant. So the funeral director will talk to you about all of those logistical details, maybe the date, the venue, the cars, the flowers, those kind of arrangements around the ceremony itself. But once we start to get into the music and who'd like to speak and how do we make it really personal, and do we put games of bingo in there, or do we have whiskey shots over the coffin, all those sorts of brilliant pieces and touches that make a service really personal. That's crafting ceremony, and that's going to be the topic of episode 3 of Over My Dead Body. So tune in next time to hear about all of those questions I would be asking you if I was meeting you to craft the ceremony for your loved one.
Okay, guys, so one of our features is obviously the question of the week, and you've been going crazy on all our socials, messaging in, and one of the questions that we'd like to look into this week is, does the service have to be religious, or who creates the service and crafts it? So I think this is over to you, Nicola.
Such a great question about whether to incorporate religion or not in a funeral service. And it is one that I see families grapple with so often when I'm talking to them about services. For me personally, I'd like to think it wasn't an either or question, and that if you felt like you didn't want a fully religious service, there was still that compromise where we could bring in elements of faith that bring comfort to you or to anybody else in the congregation without misleading anybody into thinking that me delivering it, I'm masquerading as some kind of faith leader. So I can only really speak for myself. I would be very clear about signalling to the congregation that this isn't a faith service, but we know that religion can bring comfort, and therefore we'd like to bring in an element of that. And we might do that via a hymn or the Lord's Prayer or Psalm 23 or other elements that a family might want. But it really comes back to the whole purpose of this podcast, which is about ensuring that people know they have choice, and that when they know what they would like to deliver, myself as an officiant, Carl, you as a funeral director, work together to try and realise as much of that as we possibly can to really create the service that truly represents their loved one's life. So for me, it's definitely not either or. It's about what feels right for you and how we make that happen in the perfect service for your loved one.
I would fully agree, Nicola, and I think what the resounding message in all of these podcasts is that the families just have choice throughout, and it's as simple as that.
So as we come to the close of this episode of Over My Dead Body, we bring you our regular feature of fondest funeral moments. Those memories that stick with Carl and I, either from doing something a little bit differently or that inspired the laughter when the occasion demanded. Which takes me back to a service right at the very start of my celebrant journey. In fact, it was my first big biker ceremony. And the deceased's family had asked if they could have a parade of his friends from, I'm not going to say Clubhouse, this wasn't the Hells Angels, but from the bar that they drank in, right up to the crematorium, probably about 50 bikes in a parade, which sounded incredible. So on the day of the service, I get to the crematorium 20 minutes early as usual, and there's a big row of bikes already there. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I've got my times wrong, I'm late, check my watch, check my paperwork. No, I'm definitely early. So what the hell are those bikes doing here? So off I go, running up to the lead biker and say, hey, lovely to see you, but why are you here and where's the hearse? So he tells me they've followed their friend in the hearse and the hearse has just turned off down the road behind us to come in the back way to the crematorium. And I'm thinking, there is no back way into this crematorium. Surely they haven't followed the wrong hearse. And over the course of a few more questions and conversation, it transpires that they had indeed followed the silver hearse, which had just passed them by on the road, rather than waiting for the burgundy hearse that they were supposed to be following. So quick call to the funeral director, who is hopping up and down saying, where are these 50 bikes that you promised me? And as I explain to him what's happened, I hear hysterics down the line and say, I'm sending the bikers back. They'll pick up the right hearse. Get yourselves back here as soon as you can, and we'll start the service when we can. But everybody agreed that the deceased would have absolutely loved that. He would have found it so funny, and it set the tone perfectly for that day. Everybody was laughing, everybody was in good spirits, and it really contributed to it being a memorable ceremony, even if it wasn't quite for the right reasons. So how about you, Carl?
Yeah, so thinking about the bikers and all that sort of stuff, I think for me, another fun memory is when you tailor make a service to an individual who potentially has been involved in, as you say, in the biker side of things, and for me is the horses. So you can't beat horses on the funeral. So when they come and they arrive with the carriage, and it's just absolutely mind-blowing. So again, it's something to be thinking about that families can arrange. You can have 2 horses, so a pair. You can have a team of 4, or you can even have 6 horses if you really want. 6 is usually just for royalty, but if you really wanted it, then we can arrange it. And that for me stands out. And when they arrive, you know, even you have the black horses or the white horses, they are just absolutely spectacular. And it's one of those moments where you think, wow, and it's tailor-made to that individual.
It is absolutely beautiful when you see that, whether it's bikes, whether it's horses, that moment when they draw up outside the crematorium and it just, the hairs on the back of your neck stand up and you think this is something really, really special. So any of those moments, whatever your loved one was into as a hobby, we can incorporate it in their service in some way.
And also, it's also worth mentioning that you don't actually have to have a hearse. You know, you can use any particular vehicle you wish. So we've had families use their own transit vans. Obviously, you can have the bikes we mentioned, the horses, you know, you name it, you can have discovery vehicles. And the one thing to mention also, as you're listening, is if you're having a bike funeral and you have the depending on what bike you have, the funeral directors have to ride on the back. So, you know, just make that point made as well.
A funeral director dressed in all leathers, Carl, is that what you're suggesting?
That's exactly it, yeah, all leather.
And what's equally beautiful about that is that moment where if all the bikes are still outside and the bearers go to lift your loved one into the crematorium and the bikers all rev their engines just as that happens and you get that wave of sound, again, just absolutely beautiful. So all of those sorts of things we can organise. So just, if you find yourself in this situation, don't be afraid to ask for what might seem ridiculous or bizarre, because the more creative, the more it will push us, and we would love to find you the answer. So that wraps up episode 2 of Over My Dead Poddy with just myself and Carl. Thank you so much again for listening. We really, really appreciate you tuning in. And more than anything, we hope that our conversation is really helping you to feel more comfortable and more informed about any time in the future where you might need to get in touch with one of us. If there's still a question that we haven't answered, there's a lot more to go, but please do drop us your questions and we'll try and address them for you. You can slide into our DMs via Over My Dead Poddy on Instagram or Facebook, or you can email us at overmydeadpoddy@gmail.com, and we'll pick those up and answer them for you as best we can. So join us on episode 3, where we'll be talking about crafting ceremony, the questions that celebrants would be likely to ask you, and what you need to think about before you meet one of those. But thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening, and we really hope you enjoyed and were inspired by this week's episode. Remember that you can get in touch with us anytime to ask a question, offer to be a guest, or to request that we bust a particular myth. You can get in touch via any of our social accounts over My Dead Poddy on Facebook, Insta, or TikTok. Or you can drop us an email at overmydeadpoddy@gmail.com. Just a reminder that whilst all of us work in the funeral industry, none of us are fully qualified grief counsellors. And therefore, if you've been affected by any of the issues that we've discussed today, we highly recommend that you seek out professional or medical support to help you with those conversations. Should you need any support, please do get in touch and we can hopefully signpost you in the right direction, but we can't offer those services ourselves. Thanks for listening, and we can't wait to bring you the next episode.